the borders of our lives sound like things that we need to be warned about, and warned about how they could be controlled by others, but also how they must be celebrated, and the very stories, the individual stories of our own borders, how they need to be told rather than presumed to fit into predefined categories. I think that's one thing that I'm hearing. And I'm thinking that in universities, we create categories like protected characteristics, so that there's different groups who are protected for different reasons, but often those topics intersect. A person often isn't just one thing, or holding in themselves one characteristic. And we were talking with Professor Adam Dinham on his keynote contribution about the fact that a person could have a belief, no belief, and religion all at the same time and straddle those things. Because a person might be born to parents of different religions or beliefs. They might hold a third position themselves. So we have the intersection between different borders of identity that are defined by others or self-chosen, but even we have intersectional identities which aren't just monochrome. They're not just one thing and one straight line in the self. Do you think there's a way to feel liberated about the borders of our lives and the borders of the groups that we live within? Where do we get to the liberation point, Pádraig?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to say and to echo from all the world's great traditions that the human person is a mystery. We don't really know who phenomenology lately. And the question is, what is being? Nobody really knows. It's utterly bewildering to try to put language around what being is. So in light of that mystery, in light of that impenetrable but nonetheless tantalizing question about what it means to be, what I think we need is language in order to explore. And what we need in what we would call these days the intersectionalities of our lives is a way within which we recognize how has the treatment being equitable or disenfranchising across various identities that people carry. And it's too easy to say, because you suffer in one part of your life, therefore you suffer in all. Like, I'm a gay man and I'm a gay Irish man. And in the context of that, I find historically Ireland has been treated very, very poorly in terms of our own sovereignty having been taken from us and only partially been given back. And then I also know, from the point of view of being a gay man growing up in a very religious Ireland, and during a particular period of time, I was treated very poorly. But that doesn't in any way take away from the fact that I'm a white man. I'm an able-bodied man. I'm from a family that had very little money, but nonetheless, I'm lucky to have parents who, both of whom left school at 13, believed in education. In fact, it was one of the major things they believed in. Study, study, study. What should I do? Study, keep studying. And so I, in the smallness of my own life, hold multiple intersectionalities, and I need to be aware about the times when I need to amplify my own voice because actually I'm being disenfranchised, and other times when I need to shut up or make space. And that doesn't demean me. In fact, it invites me into the possibility of practicing what it means to be on a community level, because being doesn't just exist in individuals, being exists in being together. And that, I think, is an invitation to a phenomenology of fluid practice. And what will benefit us there is questions towards each other, answers, and believing each other, and understanding each other, and understanding that we can inherit privilege and we can inherit loss, and that we are all more than just one thing, and that the navigation of those things itself is an aspect of dignity and courtesy and delight and shared learning and shared flourishing. And this is the kind of world that we create by those, rather than seeing the navigation and the dialogue around those to be any kind of diminishing of what has hitherto worked for some and not others.
Well, this is the perfect moment. As you're talking about the mixed bag of pain and power and privilege that come in different levels and volumes, even in the self. I think at this point, Anthony, we need to briefly introduce you and bring you into the conversation. I know you'll be itching to ask questions, but I'm sure, Pádraig, you've got some back to Anthony as well. Professor Anthony G. Reddy is an extraordinary professor of theological ethics and a research fellow at the University of South Africa, and he's also the director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture and a fellow of Regent's Park College at the University of Oxford. And we're delighted that you're able to join the conversation, Anthony. And over to you. I think you start asking Pádraig some questions. I'm going to kind of duck out here, and we'll just see where we go. Though I might help wrap things up in another 15, 20 minutes or so. If you're flagging before, just give me the safe hand gesture and I'll know to bring you to an earlier conclusion.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so thank you for all that you've said, Pádraig. So much of that resonates with my own experience. I guess the question I'd just like to kind of tease out, really, in terms of being Irish, but to what extent is that built upon a set of assumptions around what it is to be Irish in terms of history and language, and to what extent is it almost a kind of oppositional sense of that, like, you're not English, you know? I mean, so is it, so where's the tension lie in terms of it having a content of its own? And to what extent is it a kind of form of resistance because you're not something else? Because I think both of us have distinct post-colonial, decolonial proclivities.
For me, I find it a place of great flourishing. So if I ever were to think that I'll speak for myself, if I ever were to think that Irishness rested in me as a level of defense, I think that's a poor place to begin to practice flourishing culture, because flourishing culture is always about an invitation in, but there's power in invitation, and there's power in the sovereignty behind an invitation. And so for me, like, I grew up in a very particular era of Ireland: music, culture, dance, poetry, the flourishing of Gaelic culture. These things are deep in me. You know, the wall around my parents' house is about 350 years old, and it's nothing fancy. Like, it's not on any protected list. It's just stones built up. I grew up under the shadow of a ruined castle. There's all kinds of ways within which there's a clear sense of place and culture and time, and people who have moved in and become part of the community. The problem often is that when people have moved in and said, this isn't your community anymore, this isn't your language anymore, this isn't your religion anymore, we have a new name, a new God, and a new language for you to learn ours, and negotiate your own safety in a second language, in a second imagination, and in a second culture. Those are two very different experiences of culture changing. So Ireland has changed dramatically, I think, in the last 200 years and then in the last 25 years. And I welcome and love the changes to Ireland, increased ethnic diversity in Ireland, increased questions about religious belonging in Ireland, all magnificent and all negotiated through the complicated, tense democratic process. But that's not colonialism. Colonialism comes in and says, it's not yours anymore. And so I really feel very nurtured by an Irish culture, and I feel nurtured by its positive things, as well as I feel warned by the accountabilities that Irish culture has to pay attention to. And in all of that, I find that to be an invitation into something that's living and flourishing and fantastic. There are ways within which Irish culture and sovereignty has been interrupted, but I don't think that the defense of those and the establishing of those and the defiance regarding that gives me much of a sense of identity. I would be delighted to not have to worry about those things, because there's enough brilliance and delight and accountability that we have to be getting on with.
It did, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I'm interested in how you think about memory, and it's significant because, again, so you and I had previous conversations and we've spoken a lot about memory and heritage and how powerful that is, but also how sometimes it can trap us. You know, I grew up in a very working class part of Bradford, and just the other day I was talking with my sister, and we were both remarking that that all his best white friends were all Irish, because what we shared was a sense of poverty and marginalisation. But all these Irish friends were interested in that they all had a particular fixed image of Ireland that was the Ireland that they had left 30, 40 years early to come to England for work. And there was a kind of staticness to it. So when you ask them about Ireland, it was never contemporary Ireland. It was never the contemporary challenges of Ireland. It was a kind of nostalgic sort of rosy view that was so wonderful that it made you wonder why they ever left it in the first place, you know, and had not gone back.
It's a complicated thing, isn't it? Diaspora communities are often hanging on to the place they left, which is true, but they can often be quite hostile to ongoing changes. And I understand that for reasons of nostalgia, but it can be really dangerous. And I think there's some really interesting research about, for instance, diasporic Irish communities around the world and their unhelpful contribution to the ongoing situation in the north of Ireland, particularly during the latest outbreak of the Troubles in terms of 68 to 98. Similarly with Sri Lanka diaspora and other diaspora around the world. I think there's a serious question to be asked about memory and how it is that we allow memory to be a living thing, and that change in the home country, change in the motherland, however it's spoken of, that can be understood within the diasporic community. The diasporic community has something to defend, which is its own memory, perhaps its own pain, and that often can be done to the level of funding violence, and that always needs to be challenged, I think. And one of the things conversation about what it means to belong to a country, and what it means to remember and who it is that we are. How can we do all of that in a way that's flourishing? To use Ireland as an example, I think one of the major questions that needed to happen over the last while was, what does it mean to be Irish? And how does the population in Ireland, as well as then the Irish population in the United States and the Irish population in Britain, how does that internal conversation manifest itself, and how can disagreement be amplified and let it be flourishing and worked out through a democratic process? Those things are exciting invitations into what it means to hold on to one identity. Ireland isn't the only identity that people have, or Sri Lanka, or wherever, you know, every person carries multiple identities. And again, I'm interested in how the internal negotiation and how internal divisions are navigated and brought into dialogue and brought into cultural reflection and ethical and accountable reflection.